Elisa, I am so thrilled to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, Rebecca, thanks for having me on. I'm really excited to talk to you today.
This is going to be so fun. And I was telling you before we hit record, it's been so special to sort of rediscover you in this new season that God has you in. I was a huge Zoe Girl fan back when I was in middle school
Yes.
and high school. And back in June, so I listened to your conversation. It was called Race and Justice and the Gospel of Critical Theory with Monique Duson. My husband had sent me that. And man, were we in the thick of all of that craziness going on in the world. And my husband's a pastor, so we were always having these conversations of how do we walk with people and shepherd people well in the midst of all of this. And he said, I want to send you this conversation that I think will help sort of define some of these things for you and kind of point us back to the gospel and all of this, help us maybe make sense of some of it. And it was such a helpful conversation for me. So for listeners who maybe haven't listened to that, I would definitely point you to that conversation. And then I found the book. So then I'm like making the connection that they're all the same person. So I'm just so thankful for the work that you're doing and excited to have you.
Thanks. Well, I'm excited to talk with you too. I was telling you before we went on the air that it's always just extra special and sweet when someone who was a Zoe Girl fan is, followed me through to this time of my life and the things that God has me doing. So it's really kind of an extra special treat, when that happens.
Yeah. So today I'm really excited because we get to talk about your new book that came out this month. Yeah, the beginning of this month. So you're a few weeks on the other side of book launch. So that's really fun. It's called Another Gospel. A lifelong Christian seeks truth in response to progressive Christianity. And you open the book by sharing about a season of your life when you were deeply challenged, when kind of confronted by the teachings of this particular pastor, the church you were a part of at the time. And I'd love if you would just start by kicking us off, sharing a little bit about the impact of these teachings in that season for you and how God really used that season to kind of ignite this fire in you for finding true answers to the questions that you were asking.
Yeah. And I think that to best understand that question, I want to back up just a little bit and give the listeners a little bit of backdrop into it. Growing up in a Christian home, wonderful Christian family, spent most of my life in ministry in one way or another. Obviously in Zoe Girl, spent the better part of a decade touring. And so I had such a genuine faith. And I honestly don't even remember a time in my life when I didn't love Jesus, when I wasn't aware that the Bible was his word, that I wasn't at least trying to live my life by the Bible. And I got to see the gospel in action all my life. So I didn't have a blind faith. I can't say that my faith was unreflective or that it was blind or even shallow. It wasn't a shallow faith. I had a deep faith in God and relationship with Jesus. But the one aspect that had never really been tested was the intellectual side of things. And so I grew up, I was raised by artists. We just didn't have that intellectual bent at all. And so I think that because I hadn't been informed intellectually why I believed the Bible was the word of God. If you would have asked me as a teenager, or even when I was in Zoe Girl, why do you think the Bible is the word of God? I would have just said, well, but because the Bible says so, or because I just know that it is. And that really would have been enough for me. I didn't have to have a logical reason to believe that. And I think that the vulnerability that created was exposed when, as an adult, married woman with a new baby, I was invited to be a part of a really small study group at a local church right here in Tennessee, non-denominational church, evangelical church. And when I made it into this small study group with the pastor, he revealed that he was actually an agnostic. So he wasn't sure what he really believed about God and about Christianity. He was hoping that it was true. He called himself a hopeful agnostic, but nonetheless, he was in this process of what we now hear all the time called deconstruction, where all of the beliefs he grew up with were being picked apart, discarded, explained away, definitions were changing. And so through the course of being in this class, everything I ever believed was challenged intellectually.
Yeah.
And so now I found myself in the position of not being able to say why I believed the Bible was the word of God, but having someone actually convince me, at least intellectually, that the Bible had been corrupted, that what we are reading isn't really what they wrote, that what they wrote wasn't necessarily always true, that the Bible was filled with contradictions, and all of the little sort of I don't know what you would call it, just my little fallbacks that I would, when somebody would bring something like that up, weren't working, because I was forced to face these really, what seemed to be really robust arguments at the time, but I just didn't know the answers. And so it threw me into a really dark time of doubt and my own process of deconstruction, although I didn't realize that was what it was. I didn't understand what was happening to me at the time. But you're right. God used apologetics, and which is basically just discovering these reasons for what we believe, to really prove to me and show me that this faith that I had my whole life was not in vain. It wasn't for idiots or for fools. This is intellectually sustainable. This is logically reasonable to believe these things. And so it gave me a depth that I didn't have before to my faith. And so I chronicle that journey through the book, Another Gospel.
Okay, so for listeners who may be unfamiliar with some of these terms that might come up throughout this conversation, I want to define progressive Christianity. So would you start by kind of giving us maybe a working definition of progressive Christianity? What might be some of the things to look for, red flags to look for? And then in contrast, sort of define historic Christianity, as you would call it.
Very good. This is important because when people are changing definitions all over the place, or we might assume, somebody might know what in fact, this is, just to be honest, Rebecca, in some of the criticisms I receive over my work, 98% of the time, it's because they're assuming something about words I'm saying that I don't really mean, because they've done their own definition on those things. So this is a good question, an important question. So progressive Christianity, and how that even plays into this conversation, I should have said this before, was that church that I was in, that small study group where my faith was so challenged, that church went on years later to identify itself as a progressive Christian community, a progressive Christian church. And so that was really the first time I had heard that phrase. But then I just started to see it everywhere. I was seeing blogs by people calling themselves progressive Christians and books being written. And so I understood sort of instinctively what it was, because I lived through it. I was actually in a church that was going progressive, but I wanted to seek to understand how it was defined. So I spent a couple years reading the progressive books and listening to the podcasts and reading the blog posts. And so the way I would define this is, if you think of Christians historically being creedal, so meaning Christians have always been united around what they believe about God. And that doesn't mean that these are just intellectual boxes we're checking off. I mean, these are beliefs that inform our behavior. They inform how we live our lives, how we relate with God. So these are life and death beliefs. And Christians have always been creedal in the sense that we would all say, okay, we agree on these things. We can agree to disagree on other things, but this is the important thing. So largely speaking, progressive Christianity doesn't work that way. Yeah. It's not in the sense that they're united around beliefs, which is why it can be hard to define it, because you could have one progressive Christian that believes Jesus was resurrected and another one who doesn't. And now historically, that would be a problem for Christians. We would say, well, wait, that's a heresy to deny that Jesus was raised from the dead. Whereas in progressive Christianity, because it's not really about that, that's not that big of a problem. And so it's more about what you do than what you believe. I think that would be probably the primary definition. Another working definition that might help people to spot it and recognize it is that it's a group of people who identify themselves as Christian, but in areas of morality, biblical truth, cultural norms, they're trying to harmonize cultural norms with what they want to call Christianity. So if culture has come to a certain consensus, let's say on sexuality, then the progressive movement is going to try to contort Christianity into that mold and make it fit that mold, whether they say they'll reinterpret the Bible or throw the Bible out altogether. So it's basically, if you take the theological liberalism that arose in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and marry that with postmodernism, you have progressive Christianity. And then, so historic Christianity, when I was identifying progressive Christianity, I needed to think of a phrase that would be its opposite. And so a lot of people use conservative Christianity as the opposite. And I don't use that because that word has meant different things throughout history. It might mean something different tomorrow. And so I don't like using that phrase. And so I came up with historic because on my journey, that's what I wanted to discover. If I thought Christianity was false, I wanted to know what it was, I thought was false. And
Mm.
so I didn't want to reject a caricature of Christianity. I wanted to reject or accept the real thing. So I went back to the earliest Christians. What did Jesus and the apostles think they were leaving us? What was the gospel message? What was this good news that we were to take out into all the world? And then following that through church history. And of course, the church has gone off the rails from time to time. Heresies pop up all the time. There have been reformations and things like that. But to get back to that historic understanding of Christianity. And so what I don't mean by historic Christianity is that you can just go back and pull out some some mystic from the Middle Ages and say, well, this is what this guy said, so that's historic Christianity. That's not how I'm defining it. I'm saying go back to the original and trace that through, and that's historic Christianity.
If you've ever taken your earrings off at the end of the day with that big sigh of relief, you need to hear about Comfy Earrings. Comfy Earrings are flat-back, hypoallergenic earrings designed for 24/7 wear. No poking, no irritation, just beautiful, lightweight earrings that stay comfortable whether you're sleeping, traveling, working out, or running from one project to the next. They're perfect for women with sensitive ears, and they come in so many gorgeous everyday styles. Check them out at comfyearrings.com or through the link in the description. Refresh your jewelry box with earrings you'll never want to take off. Trust me, your ears will thank you. Now back to the show. Looking for non-toxic, high-quality soap made by a company you can trust? Let me introduce you to Indigo Sundries, a Christian, family-owned small business that's been handcrafting soap for over 20 years. Every bar is made the old-fashioned way and free from seed oils, parabens, phthalates, sulfates, and all the other things your skin just doesn't need. Just clean, skin-loving ingredients that actually leave you feeling moisturized and refreshed. Whether you love a good fragrance, prefer essential oils, or need a simple unscented bar, Indigo Sundries has something for everyone, plus liquid soaps, room sprays, and beard products too. Get free shipping on orders over $50, and don't forget to use code Rebecca10 for 10% off at checkout. Treat your skin to the good stuff at indigosundries.com.
Awesome. Okay. That's so, so helpful. And man, I had a conversation with my husband maybe 2 weeks ago just about the podcast and being in this world that, you and I are both in, where we interview people and share other people's messages. And I'm very thankful for your ministry, because I think the longer we're here on earth, this side of eternity, and we are communicating and sharing just people's books and messages and things like that, I want God to give me that discernment in that. And I don't think that's going to become easier the longer we go. You know what I mean? And so I'm just very thankful for this book and your story and how God's moved in that, because it encourages me and challenges me to really seek that truth in what I'm sharing and how I'm stewarding my own platform. And so something else within progressive Christianity is feelings often replace biblical standards as the means of kind of determining what is, quote, true, right? Mm-hmm. And so how would you say that we can best guard against using our experience as our standard for truth, or maybe leaning into our emotions and yet still hold deep emotions about events, ideas, or beliefs? How do we manage emotion and truth, I guess, is the heart of the question.
Yeah, that is a really important question, because you're right. In the progressive church, that is a sign to look for. In fact, so I don't think you'll find progressives to say it exactly how I worded it in the blog post that I think you're referencing, where it says feelings are emphasized over facts. That's my wording. They probably would say, well, no, we don't do that. But the way they would word it is they would say we have a high regard for personal conscience. Or, in Rachel Held Evans' book on the Bible, where she's actually telling you how to decide which parts of the Bible are true or which are false. She says, God, you have this God-given conscience. So you'll often hear that word conscience, that God has given you a conscience to help you decide truth from error. In Jen Hatmaker's most recent book, she outright says, I judge truth by the way it affects people. So basically how it makes somebody feel is going to determine if I'm going to accept that teaching or reject it. And so it's a very, what we would call relativistic approach to truth, meaning, I guess the easiest way to understand relativism would be the phrase that everybody hears all the time: what's true for you is true for you, and what's true for me is true for me. But of course, both of those things can't be true at the same time if they contradict each other. And so it can't both be true if there's contradiction there. And so in the progressive movement, you see that a lot. There's this real emphasis on how a certain teaching might make someone feel, and you reject it if it makes them feel bad or harmed or hurt in some kind of a way. And so I think, to dig down into your question about how can we manage those things, I think that your emotions are going to follow. They're sort of downstream from your knowledge. And so the way you feel about something is a reflection of what you think about that thing. And so when you have a robust knowledge of who God is and how he acts in the world, your emotions are naturally going to follow that. I think the problem that we see in so much of our Christian culture, and I see this a lot in worship culture, is it's almost this worship of worship itself. It's like we're just getting together to worship, or to worship how we feel about God even. Even that's dangerous, because we want to be worshiping God. We want to be declaring truths about who he is. And when we do that, this is kind of how I see it. When I'm doing that in church, I might feel it one Sunday and I might not feel it so much the next Sunday. But either way, God has been worshiped and truths about who he has been declared. And I would so much rather have that than the confusion of just getting all the feels, because that's what I want to do. And that's how I'm judging whether or not God showed up, or that's how I'm judging whether or not what I believe is real. Because I mean, this is life and death for me, because for most of my life, that is how I judged whether or not God was real, is if I could feel him. And I think that is exactly what made me so vulnerable to some of this stuff that was going on in the class, that threw me into such a dark time of doubt. Because when this pastor was basically able to convince me that I can recreate those feelings in lots of different scenarios. And if I was really honest, he was right. What does that say about whether or not God exists? And so I needed more. And I think that our emotions will naturally follow, but it can't be about the emotions.
Yeah.
I guess that's what I would say about that.
That's really helpful. And I love that you bring that out about worship. It makes me think of my own story. So I was raised in an independent Baptist church, KJV driven, we sing out of hymn books, and we don't believe in putting things up on projectors. And I mean, very much that style, right? And so the lifting of hands or saying amen or that type, just those things about worship just weren't present. I went to a big university. I went to the University of Tennessee for college, and that was really my first exposure to any other type of worship.
Wow.
And so I went from independent Baptist into, it was a Southern Baptist church, but very contemporary style of worship. And it took me a couple of years to kind of navigate through this like whiplash in worship style and really get back to the core of what you're saying, of the heart of it is declaring these truths about God and worshiping him and not worshiping worship itself. I love that you bring that out. And I think we've maybe all been a part of experiences like that. And I think
it's become the working definition of what worship actually is, I think, for most Christians. And that's, it's like this idea of what it is we're doing typically has become the norm. But like, I don't know if many people are sitting back going, should this be the norm, the way we're doing this? And I think that, I get asked about that so much because I am a worship leader, or at least have been up until most recently. And it's like, that's a tough question. It requires a lot of, you got to go at that one with a surgeon's scalpel, because you don't want to stifle people. But at the same time, you don't want to create an environment where you're just hyping people either. And I think it's worth people really sitting back and reflecting on that and the difference between those two things.
Yeah, that's really important. And something else that you share in the book is you share the story of your nephew, I love this analogy, smacking his head on the corner of a cabinet while reaching for a peach. And then he blames the peach as though it was the peach's fault that he hit his head on the cabinet, right? And so in a similar way, you realize that the progressive Christians around you were blaming the teachings of historic Christianity for these real or even perceived wrongs that they've experienced. And then as a result, they were just ready to disregard the entire belief system and trade it in for a new set of beliefs. And so what are some of these maybe wrongs or things that they experience that people direct towards historic Christianity? And how would you encourage us to kind of view all of this in a biblically correct way?
When I mentioned earlier that I wanted to make sure that what I was rejecting or accepting was the real thing, the reason I started to think that way is because in this class, and as I watched so many of my friends walk away from the Christianity that they had been raised in, I noticed something really kind of glaring about it is I even don't think it would be an exaggeration to say all of the ones who walked away for reasons that didn't have to be the reason for rejecting Christianity. And what I mean by that is, for example, I remember there being a friend who had been told growing up in the church that God will answer all your prayers with a yes. If somebody's sick and you pray for them, they will get healed. If you need something, you pray and God will give it to you. And so his wife became very ill, chronically ill, and they had been through years of just trial over her physical illness. And he said they had prayer chains going at their church and everybody praying, and she didn't get better. And this caused him, threw his entire worldview into question, because, but again, he was given a false version of Christianity. No, I'm not saying he wasn't given the gospel. I don't know, but he wasn't taught the truth about prayer. Yeah. And so when it didn't work, when God wasn't like a magic vending machine, it caused him to walk away from all of it and throw gospel truths out as well. So I think the problem of suffering and evil and God not just fixing it all is one reason that people will do that. Another reason that I watched people walk away is they would express that they were raised in really hyper legalistic and very hyper fundamentalist environments growing up, suffocatingly so. Traditions that way overshot scripture on practical things. People being told that if they cut their hair, it was a sin. And so you can imagine the confusion when you encounter this group of people that's like, hey, just come over here. We're not gonna hassle you about how you live, and you can just figure that out on your own, and you can still have Jesus. And I can imagine the temptation for that. Others had encountered legitimate spiritual abuse in their churches. That's something we've seen come out quite a bit. Spiritual abuse, even physical and sexual abuse in churches. And so they're rejecting the real thing along with that false thing that they encountered. And so I think those would be some of the more legitimate reasons. And then there's this good old-fashioned rebellion too, where people just don't like what the Bible has to say about certain things, and they want to reinterpret those to match culture. So they have this movement telling them that's okay too. So there's kind of a mixed bag in there, but it's always the saddest for me to see somebody reject historic Christianity based on a caricature they were given as a child.
Yeah. Something that I've heard you say more than once that I thought was so interesting and I'd never thought of is how most progressive Christians that you talk to in some way started out in the evangelical church, right? Like you don't, yes. That was so interesting to me. And once I heard you say that, I thought, man, she's right.
Post-evangelical movement. So you're not finding very many people, or I still haven't found any, that say we're Buddhist and then they heard the progressive Christian gospel and said, oh yeah, that sounds great, I want to do that, and convert. Or Hindus. And I had one atheist guy email me and say, well, I did. So maybe, we can say there's one that came from atheism into progressive Christianity, but usually it's the other way around. In fact, interestingly, I wrote a blog post a couple years ago that compared the views of progressive Christians and atheists and showed, I don't know, it was 3 or 4 things that they had in common as far as their foundational beliefs. And in the blog post, I quote Bart Campolo, whose dad is Tony Campolo. So he grew up with a famous evangelistic father, and he went through a phase of progressive Christianity and then went into secular humanism. And he makes the point that he thinks that progressive Christianity is a vehicle toward either some kind of secular worldview or atheism. And I think he may be right, because I know a lot of people who have deconstructed into progressive Christianity and then go all the way into atheism. And what was so interesting about that is I had a lot of pushback from progressive Christians on that post saying, that's not true. We're not becoming atheists. You've mischaracterized us. But I also got a lot of comments and emails from atheists saying, you're spot on. This was absolutely my vehicle out. And so that was interesting, the two completely different reactions from progressive Christians and atheists on it, where like, who would have thought it would be the atheists agreeing with me?
And that was probably really scary for a progressive Christian to read and think. That probably would be hard to own, right?
Yeah,
That
it would be. Well, and it's interesting too, because people who follow the liturgists who, it's a huge vehicle in the progressive movement to help people deconstruct out of their Christian faith, essentially. And I remember years ago, Michael Gungor, one of the founders of the liturgist, starting to say some of these things in blog posts. And I remember an atheist coming on one of his blog posts and saying, man, you'll be an atheist in no time. And Michael Gungor came back on and said, no, not at all. You got that wrong. But fast forward now, I don't think he's an atheist. He did become an atheist for a very short time and then ended up coming back to a wider type of spirituality. But essentially that atheist was correct. Yeah. Michael Gungor did deconstruct into atheism, even if it was temporary. And I think that a strong case can be made that is the trajectory.
Sure. We hit on suffering a little bit, but you share in the book about a season of suffering in your own life with the loss of your nephew, Matthew. And I'd be curious, how did progressive Christianity really kind of fall short in offering you real hope during that season? Yeah. And then for a listener who may be, tuning in today, how would you offer them encouragement in the midst of the suffering that they might be experiencing?
Yeah, so really interesting phase of life happened last year, just a couple of days after Thanksgiving. So I had already turned the book in. It was written and we had pretty much finished all the editing. Well, I guess we weren't finished with the editing, but it was in editing. And our family went through a tragedy where my 21-year-old nephew overdosed and died very suddenly. We weren't expecting it, of course. And it was just this shock, and it was quite horrific for my family. And it was honestly the darkest I'd ever felt. Just that first few hours of walking with my sister through that and being at the hospital and all of those things. And people who have experienced unexpected tragic deaths, they know what this all entails. And it's just, there aren't any words to describe the horror of it. And, in fact, it was really interesting at the hospital that night. There was another woman there who I know now was getting the same news about a loved one, because there's a cry that happens that what that cry is. And so it was a really dark time, darker than anything I'd experienced in the darkest time of doubt. And what was really interesting is that night, when I finally got home, it was probably the wee hours of the morning. I wanted to make sure everything I was feeling I could put on the paper, just raw. I didn't even know if it was going to go in the book, but I just wrote down everything. What came out was pretty raw. But what I realized, though, is that in that darkest moment, because, progressive Christianity, I was in editing for the book. It was the water I was swimming in at the time. And I remember just thinking, if I was a progressive Christian right now, this would probably send me into atheism. This would be it. This would be the thing where I'd be like, what am I holding on for? There's nothing that progressive Christianity would have to offer me in the wake of this tragedy. The sovereignty of God, the goodness of God, the faithfulness of God, that's what got me and my whole family and my sister through that time, clinging to the scriptures. Do not be surprised by the fiery trial. I remember my sister posting that on Instagram just within weeks of Matthew's death. And I'm just looking at that in awe, going, that is what Christians do. Christians know that God is good. And we can actually, when those totally just unimaginable tragedies happen, that's when we trust. That's when we know we really trust God, because we do trust him, even with that. And so I think with the progressive paradigm, that's always implicating the character of God, by the way. The Old Testament God is immoral. Some of the apostles were immoral. The things that are written in the New Testament are immoral at times, according to progressive Christianity. Well, if you're making yourself the judge of all that is good, and you're really trusting in yourself more than you're trusting in the goodness of God, then your faith is going to collapse when suffering and hardship comes. And so I think for me, it was just like I had never saw the goodness of God shine brighter than in that first 5 days or so of what should have been and what was in many ways the darkest time of my life. And so I suppose my encouragement to somebody going through a really tough time, and I kind of wrote something like this in the book, is like, we all have a choice. When we go through deep suffering, we can take the magnitude of that stuff, all of our doubt, all of our questions. And my family was questioning, there were dark, cold moments where you're like, is this all just a cosmic joke? I mean, those thoughts come, but you can take all that stuff and you can just throw it in the lap of a sovereign God and say, I don't know what to do with this, but I'm going to give this to you. Or you can shake your fist at him and declare that he doesn't exist. And he gives you the freedom to do that. You can make that choice. But I can just tell you from my limited experience, of course, people have been through much more horrific things than I have, but in my limited experience with suffering, when we throw all those things into his lap, I mean, that's when his goodness and faithfulness is the most beautiful.
Yes, I agree. We had a season a few years back. My mom's a breast cancer survivor now, but back in 2014, she was diagnosed with that. And to be honest, other than losing great grandparents when I was very young, I had not experienced loss. I had not experienced just something that shook me quite like my mom's journey through cancer. And I can honestly say God has used that season, although I would never wish it on my mom again or hope to go through something like that. It was in that season that God really showed me those things in a whole new way. And I hope that's an encouragement. I know that may feel tough in the middle of a really hard season, but you're so right. So I'm thankful to have you share that. And there's one more really big piece that I want to make sure we cover today. And that is, so you talk about in the book, you indicate that the only thing virtually all progressive Christian thought leaders agree on is that Jesus didn't die to pay the penalty for our sin. In fact, some have labeled the biblical idea of Jesus dying in our place as, quote, cosmic child abuse. How would you give our listeners an explanation of the biblical view of atonement and explain how that central doctrine of the faith is either denied or even twisted by this progressive Christian thought?
Yeah, this is a big one. This is pretty much universally a united belief among progressive Christians, because we mentioned before, it's not so much about what you believe, it's about what you do. So there's different varying views, and there are varying views of the atonement in the progressive church. But the one thing they roundly reject, at least just about everybody I've read, who are the thought leaders. I don't know about the lay people in the pews, but at least the people promoting the ideas in books and blogs and podcasts, is that the idea that God the Father would require the blood sacrifice of his only son, and they'll word it in ways like to appease his bloodthirsty need for justice or something like that.
Yeah.
They're going to view that as cosmic child abuse. God the Father doing child abuse on Jesus the Son. And so the bloodthirsty need for justice is a quote from William Paul Young, who is the writer of The Shack, who a few years later after The Shack wrote more of a theological treatise where he fleshed out the theology that was informing The Shack. And that's what he said in that book. And I want to just make a comment too. When you hear words like that, cosmic child abuse, look for the way they're framing the atonement, because very often they're framing it in a way that is a caricature of what we really believe. So God doesn't have a bloodthirsty need for justice. God is justice. That's his nature and character. So we only know what justice is because God is justice. And so our definition of justice is going to be based on his nature and character. It's not like there's some outside obligation called justice that God is beholden to, and God has to make sure that he's just. He is just. And in anything we talk about justice is because of his nature and character. And so because of his nature and character, his holiness, God is perfectly holy, which is a really good thing for us, because if there's a way for sinful man to be reconciled to him and Jesus' righteousness put into our account, so to speak, as it words it in Isaiah 53, that means that we can be with God, who is holy, which means completely separated from sin and evil and suffering forever. That's a good thing. We want that. We don't want sin in heaven. We don't want there to be an eternal coexisting of evil and suffering and us and God. We want to be quarantined away from those things, like it says in Revelation, where he'll wipe every tear away from our eye. And so I think sometimes the more negative aspects, or what people might perceive as the negative aspects, get focused on, but there's actually a real beautiful core there. There's a reason we want this to be true. But I think the cosmic child abuse charge comes from a lack of at least acknowledgement or understanding of the Trinity. Because what you have with Jesus laying his life down, which by the way, he did willingly, he said, I lay my life down willingly. No one takes my life from me. In fact, he even says, I have authority to lay it down and I have authority to raise it back up. So nobody was doing anything to him apart from his will to do that. And so what you have is not this angry, vengeful, petty father who's like, hey, punish my son in your place. It's God himself, because Jesus is God. So it's God himself saying, this has to be taken care of. I'll do it. I'll be the one to make the sacrifice for that sin and to reconcile sinful man to God. So that's the first thing I think we need to understand, is that this is something Jesus wanted to do. This is why he came. In fact, when he was telling the disciples that he was going to be killed and then resurrected 3 days later, Peter opposes him about that. And Peter says, no, let it not be so. And what does Jesus say? He says, get behind me, Satan. So it's kind of how I see cosmic child abuse. When somebody comes along with this notion of cosmic child abuse, I think Jesus would say, get behind me, Satan. That's not cosmic child abuse. This is the atonement for the sin of man. And I think biblically speaking, this is only understood with the backdrop of the Old Testament sacrificial system. So God instituted this system where Israel would bring a goat or a lamb, and there was lots of different offerings, but the big ones were the sin offering and the guilt offering. The sin offering for the payment for the sins, and then the guilt offering was to remove the guilt for the sins, and the blood from the slain animals would be poured on the side of the altar. This was the image and the backdrop that we have for Jesus' sacrifice. In fact, John the Baptist saying, behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. The Jews he was talking to understood that in the context of them bringing a sacrificial lamb for their sins. And then Jesus, of course, in the upper room the night before he was betrayed, quotes the prophecy from Isaiah 50, God laying the iniquity of us all on this suffering servant. Jesus saying, I'm that suffering servant. He quotes that prophecy and says, today this is fulfilled in me. And so it's very clear to me that that's what Jesus believed he was doing. And even talking about the new covenant in my blood, again, juxtaposed against the old covenant where they had to bring these bulls and goats and lambs. And Jesus is saying, I am that final sacrifice. And so to understand it any other way is just it's not a biblical way to understand the atonement. Now, there are lots of different metaphors the Bible uses. The Bible uses adoption language, legal language, payment language, punishment language. It uses all of those things. But to deny that Jesus' death is sacrificial or substitutionary in the sense that he's doing something, he's getting what I deserve in my place. To understand it without that element is not a Christian view of the atonement. And so I think that often it's a caricature that's presented and refuted rather than really looking at the real thing and saying, okay, let's address what the Bible really says about this and what we think about that.
Yeah, that's a really helpful lens to see it through. Man, thank you for answering some really, really hard questions for us today. This has been so much fun. And I'm just so excited about this book being a part of our 12 Books of Christmas series. So as this episode releases, we'll be in the thick of the holiday season. And one thing we're doing with all of our authors is asking them what is one of their favorite Christmas traditions or something fun that they love doing with their family during this time, just to give maybe our listeners some ideas of some things to try in this crazy, weird season that we all find ourselves in. So, Elisa, what would one of those things be for your family?
Well, ours is pretty run of the mill, I think. I think we kind of do what a lot of people do. We have a tradition where, and I'm sure many people listening have something very similar, where we do a artificial Christmas tree. So I grew up with real trees.
Okay.
A lot, and you'd pick your tree and you bring it home. But for some reason, we just did the artificial tree thing. But the kids love it, so we pull it out of the box. On a given day, we get our matching Christmas pajamas. For the last 2 or 3 years, we've done the matching Christmas pajamas, and we pull out the tree, we put it together. The kids decorate it. I make some hot chocolate. And, we watch Elf or something like that. So I wish I had some kind of like really cool, unique tradition, but I keep trying to think of one, like what could be the fun, cool thing that we do. One thing we have done, not every year, but many years, is my grandma made her pies, her special pies. And she's been in heaven for a long time now, but we'll get together and make her pineapple cream pie, which is an unusual pie. And sometimes her pecan and her for chocolate pie, those old lady chocolate pies that
Yes.
everybody makes. So we'll make those. And usually Christmas Eve is just kind of more, we don't do a big feast or anything. We'll do something fun. Like my dad makes his Mexican chili, the red chili and green chili for Christmas colors. We'll do that sometimes. So
I love that. That's so fun. I love hearing what other people do around the holidays. I'm so excited. I'm going to go visit my family up in Tennessee here in a few weeks. And it's like we have to make a list and get prepared before, we come up each time, especially when it's around the holidays. My mom just loves this time of year. And we were talking on the phone yesterday about, okay, we're going to do this craft and I'm going to go ahead and get the tree up so we don't have to worry about that while you're here. So anyway, I love this time of year. So I'm looking forward to this in family time as well. I love the matching Christmas pajamas as well. That's a great idea.
Yeah. And lots of places have them for pretty cheap now. It used to be like, wow, that's an investment to do.
Yeah.
But now it's like everybody's doing it. So it's a little cheaper.
Yes. I love that. Okay. So I have had so much fun just hearing from you today, Lisa, and I'm so excited to share this book with our listeners. So we are going to be giving away a copy of the book to a listener as a part of the giveaway that we're doing with the 12 books of Christmas. So that'll be great. And for other listeners who just want to learn more about your work and your podcast and all those things, where would you want to point people to there?
You can find everything at my website, elisachilders.com, and you can find my blog and my podcast. I'm on YouTube now. And so you can find all of that there. There's even a tab where you can buy the book from various different retailers. You can get anywhere books are sold, but if you want to get it through there, there's some tabs there. And yeah, so that's sort of the hub. You can find everything you need to know there. Find me on social media there, links to that, all that's there.
Good deal. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being my guest today.
Thanks, Rebecca.